A drink rests on the idea that four simple things can hold still together. Spirit brings heat and body. Sugar offers a round, gentle counterweight. Bitters add a quiet edge, and water softens the whole into something that can be sipped slowly without haste or hurry. Together they form a small, perfect system. Long before anyone wrote the word down, the practice was already there. In the 16th and 17th centuries, people measured by eye and hand, pouring sweet against strong in great communal bowls. They added a dash of something bitter, then lengthened the mix with rain water or melted snow. The proportions shifted with the century and the country, but the instinct underneath stayed exactly the same, unhurried and certain. In 1806, a small publication in Hudson, New York, tried to pin the recipe to paper. The definition read like a quiet poem of practicality. A stimulating liquor, it said, composed of spirits of any kind, sugar, water, and bitters. Those four partners would remain the unchanging center around which 200 years of mixed drink history quietly unfolded, era after era. The magic was never in noise or spectacle. It was in the patience of proportion, the moment when sugar dissolves and bitters spread their thin, rooty fingers through the spirit. Ice clinked softly against glass, surrendering its chill, rounding the edges of the alcohol until the whole became greater than its separate parts. Texture mattered as much as taste, and stillness let the flavors find their proper places. Styles rose and faded like quiet tides across the centuries. Glasses grew taller, ice became perfectly clear, garnishes curled into elaborate spirals, and names changed on printed menus in London, New Orleans, and Paris. Yet the architecture underneath never truly changed. The balance of strong, sweet, bitter, and soft still waits in every calm glass, patient and intact, ready for the next quiet sip. A candle burns low, the drink sits still. In the 17th century, before the tall-stemmed glass had taken its familiar shape, people gathered around heavy wooden tables and drank from shared vessels. Ladlefuls of amber liquid passed from a single bowl into porcelain cups. Citrus peel floated on the surface alongside shaved nutmeg and slow-melting sugar. The room smelled of orange oil and warm cloves. Candlelight caught the rising steam and turned it gold against dark wood. These early punches mixed spirit with water, sugar, citrus, and spice. The formula was simple and restful. Strong rum or arrack met the softening dilution of water. Sweet sugar found its counterweight in tart lemon and the quiet bitterness of nutmeg or bitter tea. Balance arrived not in a slender glass, but in a broad ceramic circle, patient and round. Each ingredient kept its voice inside the chorus. Sailors and merchants carried the custom across warm oceans to English parlors and colonial inns. Some whispered that the word punch grew from the Hindi panch, meaning five, for the five gentle elements inside. That story remains a charming legend, unproven and unhurried, like a rumor carried on salt wind through harbor taverns. No document confirms it fully. No document needs to. The sound of the word is soft enough to hold the mystery. Ladled from shared bowls in colonial gatherings, these mixtures taught the ritual of measured, social drinking. Each guest received the same proportion, the same temperate blend, the same slow stir. The communal bowl held the ancestor of every later balance. It waited on the sideboard, steady and still, while conversation moved quietly around the room. The bowl was wide enough to hold the silence between sentences. The evening stretched into calm hours, and the level of the liquid dropped by imperceptible degrees. As decades passed, the shared vessel gradually gave way to smaller, individual preparations. The ladle rested. The balance remained, intact and familiar. A single flame flickered near an empty cup. The wick burned steady and small. The quiet architecture of flavor sat patient in the dark, ready for the next century to arrive with ice, a slender glass, and a new name whispered across a bar. The century turned, and the small flame still burned. Morning light fell across a wooden table where a copy of the farmer's cabinet lay open to a page of modest columns. On April 28, 1803, a thin line of text held the first known printed whisper of the word cocktail, resting calmly between notices of spring rain and planting soil. The letters were small and unadorned, offering no explanation, only a quiet new presence in the language of the day. 3 years later, on May 13, 1806, the Balance and Columbian Repository offered a fuller shape. Harry Croswell, the editor, defined the cocktail as a stimulating liquor composed of spirits of any kind, sugar, water, and bitters. The sentence arrived without ceremony, tucked beneath political commentary and shipping news, yet its proportions would outlast the headlines that flanked it. The paper was fresh and crisp, the ink slightly raised, and the words left a faint imprint on the facing page where the book had been pressed. The 4 ingredients aligned like a familiar chord struck in an empty room. The definition did not claim to invent. It simply observed what had already settled into practice in small taverns and quiet parlors. Modern historians return to this 1806 anchor as the formal birth of the cocktail in print, though the drink itself had lived unnamed in slender glasses for some time before the type was set. The formula spoke of balance rather than spectacle, a modest list that would echo across centuries. Legends linger around the word's deeper origins, floating gently like unopened letters left on a high shelf. Some speak of the Hindi Panch, while others recall a French coquetier held in a New Orleans apothecary hand. These stories remain charming puzzles, their edges softened by distance, neither proved nor dismissed, simply offered like old coins turned over in the palm. A single short glass stood on a worn wooden surface, glowing in low candlelight. It held a clear amber mixture, the sugar gleaming faintly at the rim, the bitters circling slowly, the water softening the spirits into something patient and still. The flame burned lower, and the room around it grew quieter. The balance remained, intact and familiar, waiting for ice to arrive. The printed definition of 1806 named 4 necessary parts, and bitters stood among them as the bridge between the medicine cabinet and the bar shelf. These dark tinctures had long lived in apothecary shops, nestled between ceramic jars of dried roots and neat paper parcels tied with twine. Their passage across the threshold into the social glass happened so gradually that the bottles seemed simply to have wandered across the street at dusk, still wearing their labels of cure and botanical remedy. The bitter note they provided was not merely flavor, but an anchor, the weight that kept the other elements from floating apart. Gentian, wormwood, cinchona bark, and orange peel steeped in high-proof spirits carried reputations forged behind pharmacy counters in cities and small towns alike. Apothecaries once measured these bitter drops for stomachs and nerves with the gravity of physicians, dispensing comfort in carefully measured doses. Over time, drinkers began to seek that same complex depth, not for remedy, but for the essential counterweight it lent to sugar and spirits, the sharp botanical edge that kept the balance from growing too gentle and dull. Even as the cocktail became an act of pure conviviality, the visual language of the pharmacy remained stitched into its presentation across decades. Dark glass bottles, slender glass droppers, and paper labels crowded with copperplate botanical engravings of roots and leaves stayed arranged behind polished walnut bars like quiet relics of an older devotion. The objects themselves preserved the memory of medicinal origins, each amber vessel a small reminder that pleasure had once lived in the very same cabinet as cure. The aesthetic of remedy lingered long after the practical need for cure had faded from the drinking ritual. Bartenders continued to display the dark bottles with the same care once reserved for tinctures of rhubarb and camphor, and patrons came to expect the familiar sight of a glass dropper hovering briefly above the mixing tumbler. That slow cultural overlap between apothecary and saloon left a permanent mark on the visual vocabulary of drinking, a quiet inheritance passed from medicine chest to bar kit without ceremony or loud announcement. The candle burned lower, its flame steady and small against the dark. A single short glass rested on the worn wooden surface, its amber contents still and patient, the faint gleam of sugar catching the low light at the rim. The bitters bottle waited nearby in the shadows, intact and familiar, and the ancient balance of spirit, sweet, bitter, and water remained complete without ice, glowing softly as the room around it grew quieter and still. The candle had burned out, and morning found the glass still empty on the wooden table, its amber film dried to a thin lacquer at the bottom. A new kind of quiet entered the world in the 19th century, carried on the broad backs of ships and the shoulders of men who cut frozen lakes into heavy rectangles under pale winter skies. Frederick Tudor of Boston imagined that ice could travel across oceans, packed in sawdust to slow its melting, and his stubborn vision slowly turned the impossible into the everyday. The scraping of long saws against thick river ice became a seasonal percussion in northern towns. Blocks of crystal-cut ice began to arrive in ports that had never known such cold, sliding into cellars and pantries with a heavy, wet thud that sounded like winter itself settling indoors. The apothecary's bitters and the sugar at the rim remained unchanged, but now there was a fourth presence in the glass, a slow-melting architecture that turned warm punches into something crisp and bright. The old balance of spirit, sweet, bitter, and water found a new dimension, a tactile cold that made the tongue alert and the glass sweat in the hand. A clear chunk caught the light and fractured it into small, wandering prisms across the bar top. Ice harvesting prints from the era show teams of workers scoring frozen rivers with long saws, the lines straight and deliberate as stitches in cloth, while below-deck blocks nestled in sawdust endured the equatorial sun without hurry. This quiet industrial poetry moved across the Atlantic and around the Cape, carrying New England winters to Caribbean islands and Indian ports alike. Room temperature amber gave way to chilled crystal, and the cocktail became a cold ceremony, the clink of ice against metal, a soft percussion beneath conversation. The engraved blocks arrived thinner at the edges, but their cores remained hard and blue. The candle was lit again. One short glass sat on the same worn wood, now holding the familiar balance with a single large cube of slow-melting ice at its center, the cold blue heart of a distant lake dissolving gently into amber. The flame touched the glass and made the ice glow, and the room grew quieter. The ice had settled into a smooth blue lens, smaller now, its surface wet and gleaming in the low light. The year turned quietly toward 1862. On the same wooden bar, a new object appeared between the candle and the glass. It was a book bound in dark leather, its spine stiff, its pages smelling of printer's ink and the promise of order. Jerry Thomas published How to Mix Drinks, or The Bon Vivant's Companion. The volume gathered hundreds of recipes that had until then survived only by whisper and repetition behind wooden bars. Thomas wrote with the patience of a cataloger, listing spirits, sugars, bitters, and the precise measure of ice required to soften the whole into something repeatable. Thomas himself was known as a showman who wore fine waistcoats and could pour a flaming stream between two silver cups without spilling a drop. He moved through the great hotel bars of New York and California with the bearing of a stage actor. Yet his book stepped back from the performance to honor the quieter work of the bartender behind the rail. He never pretended to have invented every drink between those covers. Instead, he listened, watched, and recorded what others had already balanced in their own ways. The informal custom of the saloon became a recognized craft with established recipes, written so a stranger in another city could reproduce the same taste. The printed page replaced the guarded secret, and the drink became a shared language. The bon vivant's companion traveled by rail and steamship to Chicago, New Orleans, and San Francisco. Bartenders in distant towns opened the manual under their own lamps and found the same steady instructions for the sour, the sling, and the cobbler. A golden age of mixed drinks widened across the late 19th century, each generation reading the calm sentences Thomas had set down by lamplight in a room much like this one. The book remained on the bar as the decades turned. The recipes it preserved would soon guide the hands that built the Manhattan, the Martinez, and the Sazerac. A short glass stood nearby in the fading light, holding the balance of spirit, sweet, bitter, and softening water. The candle burned lower, the surface of the drink caught the flame, and the room grew quieter. The decades folded gently into the late 1800s, carrying the book with them. Bartenders across New York, San Francisco, and New Orleans turned the pages Thomas had left behind, measuring whiskey and gin by lamplight against etched glass. Each pour continued the quiet arithmetic of spirit, sweet, bitter, and softening water that had settled into habit long before these particular names were spoken aloud behind polished bars. The Manhattan took shape in those mirrored rooms, whiskey stirred with sweet vermouth and a dash of aromatic bitters in a long metal spoon. It did not arrive as a sudden inspiration, but rather as a slow refinement of proportions that bartenders had already practiced for generations by firelight. The balance shifted slightly heavier toward the grain of the spirit, softened by the dark wine and a measured whisper of sugar. Farther west, the Martinez adjusted the same four elements toward a lighter, more botanical character. Old Tom Gin whispered where rye had spoken more loudly, and the vermouth lingered a little longer on the tongue with a trace of orange. It remained a cousin to the Manhattan, born of the same gentle habit, simply tuned to a different key as the coastal fog rolled past the windows. In New Orleans, the Sazerac carried the rye forward through a wash of anise and the faint burn of Peychaud's bitters. Local legend whispers that an egg cup called a coquetier once held the first small measure, though the tale remains a charming puzzle with no lock to turn. Antoine Peychaud's name drifts through the story like the curl of lemon oil above the glass, present and fragrant, yet impossible to fix to a single definitive founding moment. These three classics arrived not as thunderbolts, but as quiet descendants of the Balance and Colombian repository formula from 1806. Each drink simply adjusted the weights, more rye here, more gin there, a rinse of absinthe, a different bitters, a twist of peel dropped in last. The glassware changed shape, the ice grew clearer, and the names attached themselves like handwritten labels on old apothecary bottles left undisturbed on a shelf. The room settled into stillness. A single balanced drink stood in the candlelight, its surface still and unbroken, holding the light. The flame held there, and the night moved on without hurry. The year 1920 arrived like a change in weather, gradual and unhurried. For 13 years, from 1920 to 1933, the American bar rested in a quieter season. The craft did not vanish. It simply began to move. Bartenders wrapped their mixing glasses in cloth and carried their jiggers toward harbors where the water met the sky in a flat silver line. Seabirds drifted above the masts as the ships prepared to sail. They crossed the Atlantic in vessels whose engines hummed low through the night. In their satchels rested notebooks filled with recipes written in pencil, the pages soft at the edges from years of handling. The Balance and Columbian repository formula traveled with them, unchanged at its core, waiting for new counters and new hands. The sea moved beneath them, and the drink remained balanced in their minds. In London lounges, Paris hotel dining rooms, and open-air Havana terraces, the newcomers set their tools upon marble and mahogany counters. Local gins, Cuban rums, and French vermouths lined the shelves behind them in unfamiliar bottles with unfamiliar labels. The bartenders measured and tasted, adjusting the weights of their formulas to match the new air and the new water. More lime here, a local bitters there, a different sugar dissolving slowly in the bottom of the glass while ceiling fans turned overhead. Recipes drifted across borders like seeds carried on a slow breeze. A Manhattan met English whiskey in a quiet Mayfair lounge. A martini adapted to the dry vermouth of Marseille. A Sazerac lingered in memory while new drinks rose to meet the local palate of palm and citrus. The old ledger grew thicker. The handwriting changed, but the arithmetic remained. Spirit, something sweet, something bitter, something to soften it. The quiet descendants of 1806 found new shelves in new cities. By 1933, the dispersion was complete, though no door had slammed and no curtain had fallen. In a room somewhere across the sea, a single balanced drink stood in the candlelight. Its surface was still and unbroken, holding the light. The flame held there. The room breathed slowly. The night moved on without hurry. The light changed. In the middle of the long century, the rooms grew dimmer and warmer, lined with rattan and dark timber that breathed like old forests. Ceramic vessels, shaped like drums and shells, waited on low tables, each one filled with crushed ice and the slow colors of sunset, surrounded by the faint scent of cut cane and vanilla. The air carried sweetness without urgency, and the walls wore masks that did not ask to be understood, while everyday restraint loosened its collar behind curtains of woven reed. Balance found new costumes. Rum met lime and almond, and a whisper of orange blossom, wrapped in textures of straw and glaze against the dimming room. The drink did not rush, and it sat in its vessel like a small torch held underwater, gathering mist on its glazed cheeks. Spirit and sweet and bitter and softener mingled in the chill of shaved frost, because the old arithmetic had traveled far to reach this carved bowl. The Mai Tai rose as the best-known name of these rooms, though its birth remains a legend told in two voices across decades of polite rivalry. Two hosts of the era each kept a different ledger of its first mixing, and their courteous disagreement, crisp and cordial, never hardened into verdict. The story stays open, a small, pleasant puzzle passed from one guest to another without conclusion, kept alive by the charm of the uncertainty itself. Some names are claimed by no single hand, and the drink seems content with that mystery. Memory keeps less of the speeches and more of the glow. What remains is the sensory world, the crush of ice under straw, the round belly of a glazed bowl, the rattan shadow stretching across a wall like a palm frond frozen in dusk. The drink posed as a still life of escape, an arrangement of fruit and frost and carved wood against the ordinary evening, offering no story beyond its own assembled calm. Bamboo creaked gently in the warm draft, or perhaps only in the imagination, while shells clicked softly and marked time without urgency. A single balanced drink in candlelight, its surface was still and unbroken, holding the light and the quiet. The room breathed slowly. The night moved on without hurry. Decades passed quietly. Leather-bound volumes rested on high shelves above dark bar counters, their spines faded to the color of dried sage, while a single window sent a slow rectangle of light across the floorboards. The old recipes slept inside the paper, waiting with the patience of ink that had dried more than a century before. Dust settled on the bottles, and no one hurried them. The afternoons stretched long and silent. In the late 20th century, Dale de Graaf began turning those yellowed pages. He stood behind a long bar with bottles ranked behind him like stained glass without a window, and he polished crystal mixing glasses until they caught the low light. His movements were deliberate and soft, measuring spirits by sight and by memory, restoring a sense of welcome that had grown thin in loud places. The old balance returned drop by drop. The early 21st century brought Sasha Petrask and a further settling into restraint. Small rooms with white tile and gauze-shaded bulbs offered no spectacle beyond the soft ring of a jigger against the lip of a glass. He taught that a cocktail needed no noise to announce itself, only the quiet math of proportion. The long spoon traced slow circles inside a frosted mixing glass, and each pour sought the exact harmony of spirit, sweet, bitter, and softening. This was not reinvention. It was rediscovery, a return to the architecture that had first appeared in apothecaries and ice houses and quiet colonial punch bowls. Bartenders read old manuals by lamplight and copied recipes into new ledgers with the same care a scribe might bring to a map of stars. Precision became a kind of hospitality, and the finished glass held no flourish that was not earned by the patient weight of its parts. Every element found its proper place again. The story ends almost wordless. A single balanced drink rests in candlelight on a dark wooden surface, and the flame threads gently through clear liquid and amber ice. Spirit, sweet, bitter, and softening meet in still proportions that survived wars, crossings, and all the vanished rooms where someone first thought to stir. The surface holds the light without breaking it. The room breathes slowly,